As we get started with this, I really wanted to, as I was preparing to do this today, I really felt like the Lord was asking me to talk about something before I go back and answer these questions. He brought up the word expectations. And so I just kind of sat down and wrote something. And I would like to kind of read through that and talk a little bit about that. And then I want to go back and answer those questions from our session last week. So this is what I wrote about expectations. It says, in a healthy season of marriage, we can usually count on our spouses for all kinds of things, like help with parenting or housework or just, the general doing of life together. We can usually also count on our spouses to be emotionally supportive. You might say that we have expectations of our spouse being reliable and trustworthy and helpful. We may even have expectations about how they will be reliable and helpful and trustworthy. And when our expectations in any relationship, including marriage, are not met, whether they are spoken expectations or unspoken expectations, we experience pain and disappointment. And we can set ourselves up for pain and disappointment when we have unreasonable expectations. For instance, most healthy, non-addicted people reasonably assume that if someone says that they're going to do something, that it'll get done. Or if they say they're going to be somewhere, we can expect that they would be there. But when a person is struggling with addictions like substance abuse, they aren't always reliable and trustworthy and helpful. They sometimes cannot be counted on to be where they say they're going to be or doing what they say they'll be doing. That is incredibly frustrating, and it can cause great pain to the non-addicted spouse. So please hear me clearly when I say this. I place no blame at the sober or non-addicted person's feet. I simply say that when we have a spouse who is struggling with addiction, we may need to change our idea for a season of what a reasonable expectation is. If we continue to expect that an addicted spouse is going to behave as if they were not struggling, as if they were not walking through a struggle in their addiction, then I suggest that we're setting ourselves up for pain and disappointment, because in that season, it's an unreasonable expectation to have. That doesn't mean that they are excused to behave any way that they want to. That's not what I'm saying. But I say that through that process, we have to look at and examine where our thinking and our heart is in that process. Because what typically happens is that we continue to have that expectation that they're going to do what they said they're going to do or be where they said they were going to be. And those are just examples. I'm sure that you have your own expectations of your spouse. And when they don't meet that expectation, but you also know that part of the reason that they're not meeting that expectation is because they are struggling internally. They're dealing with themselves. And so if you continue to have an expectation that they are going to be trustworthy and reliable and helpful and do what they say they're going to do, then I suggest that you have an unreasonable expectation for that season. It's not considering the totality of the situation and what's happening in their life. Is it fair? Nope. Is it painful? Absolutely. And I am not making light of that at all. I am just suggesting that in the same way that we have to change what we can expect from reluctance towards the marriage, regardless of the reason. Maybe it is addiction, or maybe it is an affair, or maybe it is I need to find myself. Whatever the reluctance in the marriage is driven by, or reluctance towards the marriage is driven by, we have to change our expectations of our spouses in that season, because we continue to set ourselves up for disappointment. And that is where resentment and bitterness and, just walking and living in that pain is coming from. And as I said at the beginning of this, like, of course, in healthy seasons of marriage, we can count on our spouses, or we should most of the time be able to count on our spouses to be reliable and trustworthy and helpful and supportive emotionally and in 100 other ways. But that's not where we are right now. Some of us are not in seasons of healthy marriage or relationships with our spouses. So to continue to be disappointed when we essentially know that right now they're incapable. I've heard it said that you can't give what you don't have. And basically what that means is that if you don't have love for yourself, if you don't have respect for yourself, if you don't trust yourself, you certainly cannot give that away to other people, even your spouse. And so is it painful that we find ourselves in these situations where we can't count on and trust our spouses? Absolutely. But I think we need to tear down that expectation for this season and set it aside and shift our focus away from their behavior as being a personal attack, and over onto placing our expectations in the Lord for this season. And it doesn't really matter if it is your spouse struggling with addiction or they're reluctant for another reason. Really, my whole point in talking about this first was just to say that maybe we need to sit with the Lord and say, do I have unreasonable expectations of my spouse in this season? And if I do, how can I adjust the way that I am interacting with them and my internal thoughts about this season, and shift those over to God? You are always faithful. You are always reliable. You are always trustworthy. So I'm going to put my hope and my expectation in you and your word, and I'm going to remove that burden. That's interesting. I had not thought of that before. I'm going to remove that burden from my spouse. I'm going to take that off their shoulders, because I recognize at this point in their walk, in their life, they're a human being aside from being our spouse, right? So in their walk, in their life, I'm going to remove the burden of my expectations from their shoulders. It's not forever, but it is to be reasonable in this situation, in this season of their life, as they are struggling with their own identity, with their own peace, with probably conviction from the Lord that they're perceiving as condemnation. And they're just, struggling to make sense out of life and trying to survive. So that's my encouragement today. I hope that you guys can hear my heart in that. Again, it is not my intention to give a free pass or, just excuse any kind of behavior simply because a person is walking through or struggling with addiction. I can say to you that when I went through that season in my life, and I think most of you know, when I went through that season in my life, it lasted for 8 years. And sometimes I could be counted on and, reliable and trustworthy and helpful and all of those things. And sometimes I was just living in selfish mode. And the more pressure that people around me, including my husband, put on me, the worse I felt about me. And I am not saying that he didn't have, you know, a right to want certain things for his marriage, right? Because it's his marriage too. It wasn't just mine. It was his marriage too. So I'm not saying he didn't have a right to want certain things for his marriage. But I think that there came a point of being so broken and so lost and so unreachable, just unreachable, that any expectations he placed on me um, just pushed me further away and made me feel even more like garbage. And, so my encouragement is that you guys, as you're navigating this season, because there is a balance to things, right? Um, that you sit with the Lord and talk with him about what is reasonable. What is reasonable to expect of my spouse as they are struggling through this? Part of that would have been for me picking and choosing times. Like if my husband needed something specific done and he could ask me to do that, that's great. Please don't pick Friday night when you know that I am going to be indulging in that. And I don't mean to laugh that off. I know that it's not funny. I don't mean that in that way. Just to make the point that, if you know that your spouse has certain tendencies of use for alcohol or drug abuse or whatever, um, and there are certain times when that's just going to be what they're doing. Don't pick those times to expect honey-do projects to get done or, for them to be responsible. To me, that is an unreasonable expectation of them. In a healthy season, you should be able to count on them for those things. But in an unhealthy season, in their unhealthy behavior and life, it's not reasonable to expect that you're going to have success in that. And that's what I mean by setting yourself up for disappointment and pain. And I've heard the definition before of the word insanity is to continue to do the same thing over and over and over while you expect a different result. And I like this analogy. If I want to make a chocolate cake and I have all the ingredients laid out on the counter and I'm mixing them, except they are the ingredients for a vanilla cake, not a chocolate cake, and I continue to mix those ingredients and put that pan in the oven to cook, and it comes out and I'm surprised that it's not a chocolate cake. Well, what did I put in it? I put in the ingredients for vanilla cake. So if we continue to expect a certain result, but the ingredients don't change, meaning in part your spouse's behavior hasn't yet changed, and your expectation of them hasn't changed, but you continue to expect that the outcome will be favorable or reasonable, I say you're putting in vanilla ingredients expecting a chocolate cake. So I know that's maybe sounds hard to hear that, but I think that it's appropriate to recognize that there are limitations to where your spouse is because of their addiction, and it's not fair to you. And I am sorry for how that impacts your life. I know their choices are spilling over onto you, but I think that we can minimize some of the pain and disappointment for a season by reducing the expectation of expected outcomes for them until they are in a place where they can make better decisions, whether that's being free from the addiction or recognizing that they have an issue and they're trying to make changes. And that's a process. As we have kind of talked about before, for me, coming out of that, the physical addiction or the active drinking of alcohol for me was an overnight thing. Some of your spouses and loved ones will not be delivered overnight. It is a process for them. And I've been reminded of that in conversation with other family members that I have, who have come out of addictions on their own. I'll air quote that. They came out of those on their own. They made a decision because of the great cost to them, personally, relationally, job wise. They made the decision to stop, and it was very hard for them, and they struggled and still do. And it's been, years now since they made the decision to stop physically ingesting chemicals to alter their thinking. And I can't really speak to what that process is like because that is not how it happened for me. So maybe your spouse is in a season where they recognize that there is an issue. Maybe they are trying to cut back, or when I was trying to do that on my own, I called it be better, do better, be good. And that's so weird to me to think that I used to think that way, that if I, only had 4 beers, that was better than 6 or 8. But for me at that moment, it was an accomplishment because it wasn't 10, it wasn't 12. So, that was progress for me. That was trying to make a better choice. But that didn't mean that I was ready for additional responsibility or to have expectations placed on me that I could just quit, or that next time it would only be 2 instead of 4 or 8 or 12 or whatever. It is a walking through an addiction or coming out of and healing from an addiction is a very personal, between you and God thing. And for someone who has never struggled with an obsession to something, it's really hard to understand that. So anyways, I really did want to encourage you guys that if you have expectations of your spouse while they're in active addiction, or even while they're, while they're recovering, and you find yourself constantly disappointed by their failure, or they're just simply not stepping up to the plate in the way that you want them to, I challenge you, I encourage you to take that to the Lord and have a talk with Him about what is reasonable. It doesn't mean that it will forever be that way, but Lord, in this season, what is reasonable for me to expect of my spouse or to ask of my spouse as they are walking through this? And then that encouragement that, God is always faithful. He is always trustworthy. He is always reliable. Does that help you physically get the kids bathed or the, housework done? No, it doesn't help with those practical everyday things. I understand that it doesn't impact your life in that way. But while you're carrying the brunt of the load, and I know it's a lot, but while you're carrying that, having that hope and confident expectation in the Lord and His ability to heal and move mountains for your spouse is where your focus has to be. It's where your focus has to be, so that you don't live in constant disappointment and heartbreak and resentment and contention and strife. And I know that it's easier for me to say that than it is for you to do it, but I encourage you to keep climbing that mountain. Keep going after the Lord for that. I think why part of me is a little teary right now is because I recognize that there was a time when my husband tried to do that. And years and years of that pain of carrying the burden wore him down. And because he did not invest more strongly in his relationship with the Lord and allowing the Lord to fill the void for him, he saw, leaving and having an affair as an answer, as relief. And maybe you think, oh, I could never do that. Listen, no one could have ever told me that my husband would leave and have an affair. Not one single person could ever have told me that that would happen. And so maybe that's not what it looks like for you, and that's not something you would ever consider. And I pray that that stays just like that. But don't fool yourself into believing that your resentment and your hard-heartedness toward your broken and struggling spouse is better than walking out the door and having an affair. And if that sounds harsh, again, it is not intended to be. God wants our whole heart. So don't find yourself in that place where you think, well, at least I'm not having an affair. And that's not your whole heart before the Lord. So anyway, I don't want to stay too long on that. I want to go back to the questions, which was the original reason that I wanted to open this today. Let me go in there and find those. These questions were posted as part of questions that I answered in the group last weekend, or in a room last weekend. But the original poster was not able to listen in, and I didn't record that room. So let me get in here. So I told her that I would come back and answer these questions because I thought they were really, really great questions. So even if you heard these last time, I encourage you to continue to listen. I am listening for the Lord to speak to me again through these questions and provide some information. So I want to say, and I think I've said this pretty much every time, and it's super important to me that you guys hear my heart in this. I am not an expert in addiction. I am not even an expert in alcoholism. From a clinical standpoint, I would consider myself an expert in the alcoholism that I walked through and the healing that God took me through. So everything that I say and relate may not be applicable to your spouse and their journey through addiction. But I do believe that God has shown me through the last almost 7 years that alcoholism for me, and probably for your spouses and loved ones, whether it's alcoholism or any other addiction, stems from two main things. It comes from unhealed trauma, and that might have taken place in their childhood, in their young adult life, and many other ways. But those things go unhealed. They speak very loudly to us about who we are and how we fit in this world. And sometimes that is so overwhelming and so condemning that it's very challenging to just try to be normal. And maybe, like me, your spouse has a predisposition toward addiction, toward alcoholism or drug abuse, meaning that it runs in their family, so to speak. their mom, their dad, somebody else in their immediate close-knit family was addicted or an alcoholic, and either that behavior was modeled for them as a coping mechanism, or um, they are simply seeing that as an option to quiet the discontent and the searching for who they are. And then, of course, the other thing that I really believe contributes to the ability to stay actively involved in known destructive abuse of substances is not having an alternative. And please do not hear me saying anything weird. If you do not know who you are in Jesus, if you do not have identity in Him, if your thought processes don't default to the truth of who God made you to be and who He says you are, even in faith, then the tendency is to allow those circumstances in life, those trauma events, to dictate how you behave and how you think about yourself. So let's get to these questions so I don't take up your entire afternoon. This question was asked, and let me just kind of read through this a little bit. This person says, how do I show kindness or still support my spouse while they are drinking or abusing drugs without looking like I support their addiction? I've read that some even buy alcohol for them. That would be so hard for me. I'm not going to read that part. So what would it look like? What would enabling their addiction look like instead of actually trying to help them? So the answer to this question is a little bit long, but it's super important that you hear a perspective on this. And I talked about this last time when I answered this question. I will tell you that for me, first of all, my husband did drink with me. That doesn't mean he was an alcoholic, but he did consume alcohol with me, knowing that I had a problem, knowing that we discussed it lots and lots of times, that it was a problem in my life, that it was more than recreational use, that it wasn't healthy in my life. Yet he continued to drink in my presence at dinner, at parties, at, whatever. And I will tell you that the way that my brain perceived that was permission. Now, logically, I knew that's not what he was doing. That's not what he was saying. Yes, you should drink, or here, it's okay for you. I know that's not what he was saying. But what my broken brain, my alcohol addicted brain, perceived him drinking in my presence, I perceived that as permission. And it never really mattered to me that I was putting down 4, 5, 6 beers while he was having a beer. There's a huge difference in those two things. And I'm not here to advocate on one side or the other of having a beer or a glass of wine or whatever with dinner. That's between you and the Lord. I will say to you that I don't necessarily believe that all people must be teetotalers or complete non-consumers of alcohol. I can never be a person who consumes any amount of alcohol ever again, because it's already been proven and shown to me through my choices and my life that I cannot control it. But I don't think that means that every person can't control it and should never have any. Again, that is between you and the Lord. But back to the point of this question about enabling, if your spouse has a issue with something, no matter what it is, and you are participating in that, even if it's a healthy participation for you, i.e., having a glass of wine, but your husband is an alcoholic, I suggest that's not necessarily enabling them, but I will suggest to you that that is encouraging them. And you should probably have a conversation with yourself about the value of alcohol in your life. Certainly, I would not suggest that you purchase alcohol or drugs for people that you know are struggling. You should not do that. And it says, what would it look like we are enabling their addiction instead of trying to help them? I want to be kind of clear on this and say that really there isn't anything that you can do to help them. To help them. In other words, if you're actively coming against that in a combative type way, or reminding them that they're over consuming, or actively participating in disappointment and the cold shoulder and that kind of stuff, when your spouse is consuming, you're I don't know how to say this. I don't want it to sound like you can't ever say anything, but I don't think that you recognize that doing those things, listen, they're already in turmoil. They're already struggling. They already know that it's an issue. They already have immense guilt and disappointment in themselves. And you're heaping that on top of them. So when you're struggling with their choices, you have to take that to the Lord. They can't carry the weight of your disappointment in the middle of their own disappointment. They just can't. And it's not reasonable for you to expect them to do that. And there is a point at which I think that becomes manipulative, even if that isn't your intended choice. It is. It comes across as manipulative because now you're taking what they're already struggling with and making it about you, instead of understanding that they are struggling and taking them before the Lord for healing. That's where you can have impact. That's how you can help. That is how you can help them. Take them before the Lord and ask Him to show them their own heart, to reveal Himself to them, to reveal their identity in Him to them. That's what changed my life. Not the conversations that my husband had with me about my poor choices. I already knew that. I already felt bad. I already hated me. I didn't need to know that he also hated that behavior. I knew that. Okay, let me get to the next question. Says, what about the healing and deliverance process of a person who abuses alcohol and other drugs at the same time? Would you say that all of those addictions have the same root and they are just using different means to numb themselves? Yes, they all have the same root. And I think later in this question, she talks about why a person would, don't people usually have a drug of choice, or stick with one or the other? I would say that typically that's probably true, though what I do know is that even inside of, let's say, even inside of alcoholism, drinking beer versus drinking, a liquor, a hard liquor, versus drinking wine, those all sort of hit your system in a different way. And I don't wish to glorify the effects of any of that. So we don't really have to go into the details of that other than to say you might think of it like different flavors of or different like desserts. Like it's all dessert, right? But maybe chocolate chip cookies or ice cream or, apple pie. They all do a different thing for you. You crave a different sort of, you know, experience with each one of those. And I would say the same is true inside of even alcohol, but the same is also true of different mind altering, which is what drugs and alcohol are. Different mind altering substances hit a person in a different way. And that sounds really kind of probably uh, weird, but you know, like I have smoked pot before in my past, so I know how that feels. And that's a completely different feeling or high or whatever than alcohol. I haven't done other drugs, but I would absolutely imagine that the same is true. There's a reason why people get addicted to different substances. Some people choosing, meth or cocaine or alcohol or whatever. Um, they're all hitting in a different kind of way. But I don't think that it's uncommon for people to prefer to use more than one substance, depending on what they're looking for out of that substance. So I hope that makes sense without glorifying any of that. Let's see what the rest of the question was. Later in here, she says that I guess her spouse says that he drinks his sorrows away. And I just wanted to speak to overall, really, that goes back to what I feel like the Lord showed me about trauma being sort of a gateway. And maybe you've seen that, on Facebook or social media. It says, certain things are not a gateway to harder drugs or whatever. Trauma is the gateway, and I agree with that 100%. Trauma is the gateway. Unresolved, unhealed, unsurrendered, traumatic events that occur in our lives is the gateway that could lead a person to abuse substances. So I don't know, something is happening to my computer. Sorry, let me close that out. Okay. And so I think when you can really recognize that, when you can understand, even if you don't know your spouse's story, you don't know what things they experienced either as a child or a young adult or whatever else caused that. I can tell you 100% that growing up, the things that I went through were completely and 100% dysfunctional, abusive, neglectful, traumatic. They left me feeling afraid of everybody and everything, never knowing when that other shoe was going to drop. And it would be really easy for someone to say, well, you're a grown woman. Those things happened in your childhood. You're a grown woman. You should be over that, or just get over that, or just move on. Listen, there's a part of us, especially when that occurs very young, that is arrested in emotional development because of those traumatic things. We don't learn how to navigate those situations in a safe and healthy and productive way because those events were so traumatic that they altered us. Oh, that's so hard to say. I'm sad sometimes for the little girl in me that went through the things that she went through, and I am so thankful that I am working through healing. But man, I think back sometimes on that little girl, and my heart hurts so bad for her because she was so scared and unprepared to deal with those things. And as a result of that, yes, I grew in age chronologically, but I didn't necessarily learn how to handle those kinds of things better, and not that those traumatic events were reoccurring over and over into my teen and adult years, but things that made me feel like I felt when I was a little girl were happening. Those triggers, that's what that word is. When those things, when something would happen and it would trigger that memory or that experience, I felt 8 years old again. I felt 10 years old again. Like that thing was happening all over again. And I shut down. Well, you can only shut down for so long before it starts to genuinely affect your ability to function in a reasonable and normal way. And if these things, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, thank you, Jesus, that you have no idea what I'm talking about. For those of us who did walk through those things, we are learning in our adulthood, right in the middle of life, how to process life. And when those things are triggered and go unhealed, or we won't surrender them to the Lord, because sometimes we do know, man, I need to deal with this, but we won't surrender them to the Lord. And we allow ourselves permission to consume substances that are unhealthy, that don't make any logical sense, that are destroying our families and our relationships with our children and our spouses. What we're really trying to do is soothe. So I know that it's really incredibly painful as that spills over onto you as a sober spouse, but try to see it from that perspective. I'm not excusing poor behavior. I'm not saying let people act just any kind of way, but at least try to understand it from that perspective. And when you cry out to the Lord for them, please don't let it just be, God, help them stop. Because I'm telling you, I'm almost 7 years into sobriety and walking with the Lord, and I'm still healing not only the things that occurred during my addiction, but I'm going back to heal things that happened in my childhood. So anyway, understand that that is part of what is driving the addiction, even if they don't recognize it. And you don't have to know the details of that. You can go before the Lord and ask Him to help you intercede for your spouse, for the root cause of what's happening with them that happens to be manifesting itself through addiction without knowing all the details. You can do that. Okay, so the next question says, how do we act around them when they are drunk, or for them to not feel judged or condescended to? You act like you. You act like you. You be who God made you to be. That loving, helpful, gentle, considerate, sacrificing, loving spouse. You be that person. You don't change who you are, who God made you to be, because of their state of intoxication. That's not authentic. And it might, if they recognize that you're behaving differently simply because they're intoxicated, cause them to feel even more uh, I don't know, highlighted or attention drawn to. Don't just be who God made you to be and behave the way He called you to behave. And then the last question that she asked was, how do we effectively pray for this specific area of their life? And I think that we've kind of talked about that some. Um, you don't have to know specifically what the root cause is um, in order to pray for them effectively. I think the things that were missing for me, the main thing that was missing for me that drove me to alcohol as an answer was not knowing who I was in Jesus. I didn't have a relationship with Him, and I certainly didn't know what His Word says. And I'm not suggesting that you go pound your addicted spouse with Scripture, because that might not have the effect that you think it will. But you can certainly pray God's unchanging and absolutely life-giving Scripture and truth over your spouse in the quiet of your closet between you and Him. And then as you are interacting with your spouse, whether they're sober or intoxicated, you be the hands and feet of Jesus. You see them for God, who God created them to be. You treat them the way that God created them to be. You call them up to that place by the words you speak to them and the respect that you show them for the person that they are. You don't have to respect their behavior. You don't have to honor or cherish their behavior. It's painful. But you can separate the behavior from the person. We are not what we do. Not you and not your spouse who's struggling. We are who God created us to be. And they don't know that yet. They can't walk in that yet. They can't receive that yet. But that does not mean that you do not treat them that way, that you do not call them up to that place by how you honor and respect them as a person. I will tell you that my husband, there were times when he absolutely spoke life to me. And I am serious when I say that it probably saved my physical life because he believed better of me than I could ever have believed of myself in that season. He gave me hope by the kind and respectful things that he said about who God made me to be. And it gave me enough hope to think it won't always be this way. I won't always be lost in this. Someday I'll know who I am. Someday I'll feel worthy. Someday it was enough to hold me until I surrendered my life to the Lord. Don't think that you don't have that exact same position for your spouse. And I know it's hard, day after day after day. I know it's hard. But if you will continue to surrender your expectations of the timeline, of what it looks like for them to not be in that place, if you will continue to surrender that to the Lord, pray for their identity, bring them before the Lord, and treat them with love and honor for the person that God made them to be, He is going to have to deal with their addiction. He is going to have to deliver them. He is going to have to give them the desire and the courage to come out of that. That's not your job. You can't do it. Trust me. If anybody could have saved somebody from alcoholism, it was my husband. He couldn't do it. He was incapable because it wasn't his place. It's not your place either. So as you walk through this with your spouse, I know that it's very difficult. And I encourage you to continue to keep your expectations in the Lord. to continue to surrender the hurt to Him. We talked about this last time. If you are rehearsing the bad behavior, the poor choices, and how their life is spilling over onto yours, you're living in a place of resentment, bitterness, contention, strife. If you're living in that and you cannot get past it, I encourage you to go seek help. Maybe that's with a Holy Spirit filled, Bible believing, Jesus loving counselor, and they are out there. Go talk to somebody. Go learn how to navigate life, and heal some of that stuff that is absolutely a trauma to you, what you have walked through with your spouse. Go get that stuff healed. Go work on that stuff. Maybe that's in groups like this where we can support each other and help understand each other. There are also, it's kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous or an AA group, but for Christians. It's called Celebrate Recovery. Most churches, and maybe those are larger churches, have a Celebrate Recovery program. You will be able to join in a smaller group and a larger sort of communal, everybody, whatever they're dealing with, worship and teaching time, and then break off into a smaller group that is more specific to what you're walking through. Those are great resources for you to take care of you. And of course, take this stuff to the Lord. Nobody was meant to walk through this stuff alone. It's hard. It's embarrassing. It's painful. It's not fun. And I get that. But I'm going to ask you to take some initiative toward doing this differently. If you have been struggling and not even sure you want to continue standing, and is this person even worth it? I'm not the greatest thing since sliced bread, but what I do know is that God redeemed my life. Like, oh, God redeemed my whole life. He took all of that pain, and He's allowing me opportunity now to speak to you. You couldn't have told me 7, 8 years ago that I would be doing this. I was lost. I was broken. I was the one causing the problems and the pain and all of that. But God redeemed my life, and He can do the same thing for your spouse, for your marriage, for you. So run after that. Run after it, run after it, run after it. I'm going to look over here really quick and see if we have so we have one person saying, my shame kept me from approaching God. I could not even pray and ask for help. And I so identify with that. I absolutely remember being in that place and how challenging that was. And that is why I encourage you guys, your spouse is probably, maybe they're connecting with the Lord in some way when they're sober or not intoxicated. And maybe they're not at all. But you can intercede for them and pray over them for courage. It is so embarrassing to be not in control and to know that you are destroying people around you. It's mortifying. It's just, that is the perfect word for it. It is so shameful. So pray for your spouses that they would have the courage to trust someone and Of course, ultimately, that's going to have to be God for it to be sustainable and long term and life giving. But if they can reach out to anybody, and don't be offended if it's not you, if they can reach out to somebody, one of the things that I pray over my husband, which would have been great for him to have prayed over me. One of the things that I just in standing for my marriage is that God will send the Nathans into his life. I don't have influence to speak into my husband's life. I don't have that influence. I don't. So God, you send someone to speak to your son directly to his heart. He hears from you. I know he does in a way that he'll receive it. You send somebody. Send somebody to talk to him. Okay, so let's see. It looks like we have another question. Did you face that fact by using anger? Like, I can't stop. I know I'm hurting everyone, so I'll just be mad that this is beyond me and no one understands. Oh my gosh, yes. Did I face that by using anger? 100%. Because honestly, underneath it, it was utter frustration that I could not control it. I could not stop. I could not make my life different. And I was so frustrated by that. And I was angry. So I decided there must not be a God. And if there is, he doesn't love me. And so I'm going to be angry with everybody, and I'm going to defend this. You couldn't possibly understand. You don't know what it's like to have this problem. Don't talk to me about being reasonable and responsible and all of those normal, healthy things. You don't understand how hard my life is and why I do this. Absolutely, that was my attitude. Yeah, and this person says, and we perceive that anger as rebellion. Um, it's scared. It's, I know my life is out of control and I can't do anything about it because I can't fix it. It isn't as much about rebellion as it is being afraid, just being terrified. I remember toward the end thinking, I'm going to die. I am going to drink myself to death. I'm going to die in this. I'm going to die a disappointment of a mother, of a wife, as a daughter, as a human. I'm going to die in this. And the only way for me to stay out of the tears and the overwhelmed feeling of that was to be angry and to tell people they didn't understand. That hurts my heart so much. You guys, I've said this before. I don't live in shame over my past. But that doesn't mean that my heart is not broken for what I can look back on now and see as just, so much unhealed, so much brokenness, so much lost. It breaks my heart. And if it breaks my heart, and I was drunk for most of it, I can only imagine how hard it is for you guys to walk through having a spouse who's walking through that. I reached out to my husband recently and just said, and I've done this over the years, this is not something necessarily new, but I was reminded again. And so I just reached out to him and said, I'm so sorry for the pain that I caused you. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't something that you could ever heal in me. It wasn't your place. And I'm so, so sorry for how hard it must have been for you to walk through that. Um, and he doesn't respond, and that's okay. I didn't send it for him to, I don't have unreasonable expectations of my husband in this season. I understand that he is dealing with his own stuff between him and Jesus, and I simply wanted to acknowledge his pain and tell him that I'm sorry for it. Okay, the next part of that was we need to encourage them to just be honest, or does that make it worse? That's a good question, and I think that's going to be dependent on where your spouse is in their addiction, and that looks totally different for everybody. I don't know that I would have been able to receive being honest from my husband, because I would have thought he's, even if it's not the truth, he's trying to manipulate me into admitting that this is a problem and I need to quit. That's where this is headed. It's headed towards, you want me to quit. And I don't know how to do that, so I don't want to talk about it. Yeah. So I think what is probably more to the point is if your spouse is opening up to you about what they're walking through and how hard it is for them, that you not immediately turn that into, yeah, I know it's hurting me. Like, I know it hurts you and I'm not being dismissive of that pain. But if your spouse is being vulnerable enough to say to you, I know this is a problem and I don't know how to stop, they are not asking for advice on how to do that. They are simply sharing a moment with you that says, my life is out of control. Help. And all you really can do is listen and hear what they have to say. Ask them, how can I support you? How can I be there for you? How can I pray for you? That's all you really can do. That tells a person that you're concerned about them, not how their behavior is affecting you. And I know it's affecting you, but you have a relationship with the Lord. So you're going to have to put your big girl pants on and take that to the Lord. If your spouse is opening up to you about what they're struggling with, and I don't care what it is, whether it's addiction or pornography or another person or whatever, you're going to have to sit yourself down. You're going to have to look at your spouse and say, I'm so sorry this is hard for you. How can I support you? How can I pray for you? What do you need from me? Because that's what love does. That's what love does. Love doesn't make everything about you. And I'm not saying it's not painful, but love doesn't make everything about, yeah, your behavior is affecting me. There's an appropriate time for you to deal with that. But not when your husband or wife is opening up to you about their struggle. Trust me, when they're delivered and they're walking in relationship with the Lord, there will be plenty of time for discussion about all of that. How how their behavior affected you. Trust me, I'm still walking through that. It's almost 7 years later. Okay, let me see this next question. Oh, she just says, I feel like you are weeping over the truth of what those in addiction are going through. I think you're interceding for them in your tears right now. Yeah. Like, I never want to come across as if I'm somehow making excuses for the person who's walking in addiction. And I know we kind of talked about this last time, like it seems like it's a choice that they're making. And for some of them, I would say that's accurate, depending on how deep or how bad the addiction is. They are making a choice. I remember distinctly when it switched for me, um, from I really shouldn't be drinking this much or this often to this other place that was I'm obsessed or I'm obsessed with drinking. It went from feeling like I had a choice to not feeling like I had a choice. Um, so, oh, I forgot where I was going with that. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So, does anybody else? We went through the questions that I had from the original post, and I was able to talk about expectations, which I feel like the Lord put on my heart to do today. Um, so, does anybody have any follow-up questions or um, insight or things that you want to share? I'm sorry, I really didn't mean to be all weepy. Okay, I don't hear anybody. Um, oh, well, they are certainly, yeah. It says your tears are touching. Um, I don't know. I tried it when I talk about this. I try to not go back to the place of reliving the emotion of what I walked through, because that would be re-traumatizing for me. But I also, being on this side of healing and sobriety, I think that my heart is really broken for the woman that I was that lived in that. Um, and my heart is broken for, I mean, truthfully, my heart is broken for what my husband went through, um, as I walked through that addiction. Um, it's sad. It's, it's so sad. And I wish that someone had been able to, I wish he had let somebody in to help him walk through what he was feeling and dealing with. Um, because I think that our story would have been different. And I am not, I know what it took for me to come out of all of that. And I'm not saying that God instructed my husband to have an affair. But I will say that God, just as the word says, God works all things together. He causes, some translations say, all things to work together for our good, for those that love God and are called according to his purpose. And he certainly used even that situation with my husband to work for my good. And now I am in a position to pray and intercede for him in the way that I know he wishes he could have prayed and interceded for me. It took what it took, and here we are. Um, so this says we need this though because we live in the anger. Yeah, we need to get in touch with the real issue, which is where you are. It ushers in compassion, and we need to have broken hearts. Whew. Yeah, we need to have broken hearts over what they are snared in, not angry. Yeah. Yeah. And so if I ever come across like I don't care about your feelings or that your feelings, if I say it in a way that makes it sound like your feelings are invalid,
That is not my heart. My heart is to help you understand what goes through the mind of a person who really feels like they have no control over something that's destroying their life, to pull you into a place to see the other side so that you can step out of anger and into a place of compassion, to be at the root of that, which is calling them out of that darkness that has the natural effect at some point of benefiting you because the marriage is stronger, the family is stronger, the relationship is stronger. But more importantly than anything, I said this earlier, that I am a believer that my husband, when he was able to step into that place of compassion and call me up to my identity without judgment, without anger, without putting his feelings and weight on me, those seeds of hope are what were planted and kept me alive. And maybe that's extreme, but it was so dark in there. It was so dark in there. And those seeds of hope were just enough light to keep me moving forward, bumbling, making lots of mistakes, doing it all wrong, but alive, until I had the courage to surrender my life to God. He's the one that brought deliverance. He's the one that brought healing. But my husband is the one who planted the hope that it was possible. So that's not to say that you guys are responsible for healing your spouses. But oh my, what influence you have to speak into their lives, to remind them of who God created them to be, to give them hope until they can surrender their lives, until they can trust Him to do what no one else has been able to do in their life, to bring order, to bring control, to bring healing and hope. That's all Jesus. So, yeah, yeah, somebody said it truly hurts so much to see them in so much pain and not knowing how to go to Jesus to find the healing. You're right. I have family members who are still struggling, and it is heartbreaking to be on this side of it, because I know it happened in my life. I watched it happen. I lived it. It happened for me. Jesus healed me. He delivered me. He was the answer. And it's so hard to watch other people walk through it. But because I did experience it for myself, I know that my place in that person's life that is still struggling is to honor and respect the person that God made them to be, to pray the truth and life over them, and to trust the Lord to do what only He can do. That's my lane. That's where I stay. And it is different than a spouse relationship. So it is probably, just on a functional level, easier. I don't count on this person to, in the way that you would count on a spouse. So it is different. But those tenets are still in place. Those tent pegs around what's happening are still in place, and it's still the truth. Okay, I don't want to take up your entire afternoon. I thank you all so very much for listening. I will take this recording and listen through and edit out anything that needs to go, and try to get this posted to the group so that others can come back later and listen to it. You guys are welcome, if you have additional questions, to post them in the group anytime. Remember that our group is private. Only people in the group can see what's being posted. You always have the option of posting anonymously. So if you don't want someone to know that it's you that posted the question, you can anonymously post. And we, myself and the other admins and moderators can answer that question without revealing your identity. Yeah, so in the meantime, if you have other questions or things that you want to talk about, I'm here. I've said this before and I will continue to say it because it's so, so, so important to me. I believe this is what God gave me to do. I never talk about any of this with the intent to glorify the enemy. I only talk about this to expose the lies of the enemy, the ones he speaks to you, the ones he speaks to your spouse or your loved one that's walking through and struggling with this, and to reveal the truth of what God says about us as people, as his children, as his sons and daughters, and to reveal the identity that God gave to us. So let's stay in that vein. You remember that. You remember that we're exposing the lies of the enemy. And we are staying in our lane by remembering that God created our spouses, no matter what they are struggling or walking through, just as he created us, as his sons and daughters. That's who our spouses are. And we're going to love them and walk through life and support and uphold them and intercede for them, because that's what love does. That's what love does. And in the meantime, if you need additional support, please, I encourage you, reach out and get that help. There's no shame in that. You're not exposing your spouse by needing help to navigate this. Please do that. So I'll just close this up in prayer if nobody has anything else. Lord, I thank you so much for who you are. I thank you for redemption. I thank you for healing, God. I thank you for who you are. I thank you that you are trustworthy, that you're reliable, that we don't ever have to question if you're for our good, because you are, because you love us. So God, as we walk through navigating some of the most challenging and difficult things in our marriages, in our relationships with our spouses, God, help us to keep our focus on you. Help us to trust you and lean not on our own understanding, but to acknowledge you in all of our ways. You make our path straight. So if it's crooked, help us see that. Bring our heart back into alignment. Reveal the truth so that we can walk in alignment with your word, with your will, and with your heart. Help us to love God as you love. Help us to extend ourselves beyond what we even think we can, because we're surrendered to you. We're counting on you to provide that strength, that wisdom, that discernment, that grace. God, there are places that we need to forgive our spouses for how their actions and choices and words have hurt us.
then God, help us to do that. Help us to forgive them, God. You forgave us. Help us to forgive. Help us to do that. Help us to love well, to take care of ourselves, and to trust you. God, I thank you for redemption. I thank you for healing and wholeness. And I pray over everyone represented here, no matter what their struggle is, God. I pray for your complete and total healing, even if it's a process, that you're moving us from one place to the next, bringing healing and revelation to our lives for your glory, God, for your honor. So this week, we just surrender ourselves, body, soul, and spirit to you. Say thank you, Jesus, for loving us, leading us, guiding us, giving us wisdom. We give our hearts and minds to you, Lord. Help us to represent you well. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'm going to let you guys off of here and go see if I can cut this video down some. It's not a video. No one was recorded. It's on a blue screen. So anyway, I'll try to cut this audio down. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, put them in the group. I'm happy to help. All right. Love you guys. Talk to you next time.